Alrighty, welcome to Roundtable Decision, and this is my fourth edition as far as my book series is going, and I plan to do one at least once a week, and I plan to keep to that mainly because of keeping consistency for myself so that I keep going to the project and keep doing what I need to do as far as that goes. I'm going to make sure that we're going here. Alright, we'll look good. So yeah, that's kind of the idea, is mainly to hold me accountable. Because yes, it is a project I want to do and something I do enjoy doing, obviously. But it's also something I need to set deadlines for and set motivation type of things for so that I can keep going. Because writing is not something that naturally comes easy to me. But that said, it's something I enjoy doing, obviously. So in my first couple streams, I read out all of my novel in the 10 pages I originally wrote for a school project. On the second stream, I kind of talked about the two ideas coming off of it. And in the third stream, I talked about a little bit more on the one idea that I'm going to write first, and then go to the second chapter idea and see which one I kind of like better. But in today's stream, I'm going to show you the paragraphs I've written so far for my first idea, along with the other ideas I have along with the first chapter. In other words, I'm going to show you what I've written and what I have planned to write so far. But I thought the best place to start, those who didn't catch my last stream, would have seen that I was debating where I wanted to kind of go in my direction, and that was mainly what the last stream was about. And I decided, well, there was a couple different ways I could go. I could either go straight to describing the poor part of the medieval town, I could go straight into describing the rich of the town, or I could go straight into describing the way the kingdom looks and the castle and the scenery and all that. And what I've written so far is mainly the first option, or one of the first options I would say, and that is mainly I went a little bit in describing the castle, and then I'm going to go into describing the poor. But I don't want to describe the castle fully because later in the chapter I plan on describing the defensive part of the castle in vivid detail. Because those who didn't catch when I read the first stream and read the novel I've written so far, it's in pretty good amount of detail and a lot of adjectives within the writing. And that's the way I want my book to be. I don't want it to be overly fluffy with these adjectives so that it then makes reading it hard. But I do want the book to be interesting and captivating so that you would want to keep reading the book further, as every reader or every writer wants to happen. So that was kind of what I was thinking. I'm like, okay, I think the best route as I was trying to write it out was deciding what I wanted to do. And I decided, well, I think I should go ahead and describe the castle in a little bit more detail and to kind of continue the thought process I had within that. So that's probably why you're looking at this picture here. And this is Dover Castle, as I've wanted to make my castles and what I am writing about in more detail and to base them off of history and actual castles that did exist. And by doing that, I've decided to look at a few different types of castles. And a castle I wanted to base my castle in the book off of was the Dover Castle, which is one of the biggest, or the biggest castle in the medieval times and within England as the environment. And it's on top of Dover Hill, as you can see in the picture, as you have your massive hill and then you have your wall surrounding it. And as you can see from these other images on Google, you'll kind of see a similar structure, with this one more being a side view of what the castle were to look at, with the wall, and then you have the castle behind it, and what you typically think of the castle when being where the keep and where the royalty would stay, and where a lot of fantasy series focus their attention on, like in this picture here, where you have the keep and you have the castle, and what typically people think of, as I kind of just said. But that's not all what castles are into, and what I mean by that is a castle isn't just the keep and isn't just the main piece where you have the castle and then the towers and the archery towers and the walls just in front, like if you were to just take this image here. But rather, the castle is the whole entire feature. It's where it is placed and it is where walls are built. So I wanted to describe the whole scenery of what my castle were to be. So that is kind of where I decided I would start. my first idea. And I had this short little YouTube video I found of the castle. It didn't have any volume to it, but it just kind of shows a aerial viewpoint on either a helicopter or a drone overlooking the castle from a topical viewpoint. So as you can kind of see with the image and it gets closer, is you see just how big the hill actually is. So just from a defensive standpoint, it would be very hard if you were foreign troops to not only go up the castle, but to get past the walls. And that is why castles were very strategically built. And Dover Castle not only was on top of a hill, but had access to the lake or ocean behind it. So it had access to water, and that access to water played a pivotal point in how the castle was able to defend itself and able to act as a strategic location for the rest of their allies or for themselves, with having access not only to land, but having access to water, and therefore controlling the port or access to the passage of water that many people wanted to get access to. And not only were the castle walls not close to each other, they were also in a strategic location from that point. So what I mean from that is, when you have a castle, you don't just build one wall and then right behind it have another wall. Your castle walls are separated in some distance apart, and that makes it a little harder for the enemy, not just if they were to get past the first wall, but they would also have to get past the second wall. And again, you're just trying to make the job of the enemy and the job of the people who are wanting to attack you or foreign empire that wanted to attack you harder to do. So I was looking at this video and looking at the images on Google Images and reading a little bit more about how castles were built. And that brought me to this next article here. As you can see, castle walls, and also called curtain walls. And I haven't watched their video here yet because I wasn't necessarily at the stage to describe every feature of the wall, but I more wanted to look it up just to make sure that my understanding of what castles were built on was the understanding and was actually historically what happened. Because as I've already said, I wanted my book to be kind of based off of historical components, but still having a fantasy related aspect to make it more interesting and to fit more into today's time. Excuse me. And as you can see in this passage here, it says the wall itself was often built of something called ashlar. This is the name for stones cut into shapes with square edges. The type of stone would be varied depending on what type of available to the builders, and a space in between the ashlar stones was filled with mortar. The mortar would bind with the ashlar stones together, much like a cement would. Mortar is a mixture of water, sand, and lime. This ashlar wall, when completed, would often be coated over with plaster and whitewash. A good example of ashlar can be seen in the walls of the Bodnum Castle. So I was going to quickly search on air here the Bodnum Castle, because I haven't really looked too much at the Bodnum Castle walls, and I more did research on other types of castles, because a lot of castles are kind of built on the same thing. Like when I typically tend to think of a castle, I think of a white stone sort of structure that is kind of faded over the time. And that's kind of what you can see with the Bodnum Castle as well, as you kind of see a similar coated tan to what the walls were that aged over time. And that was mainly because of how the castles were built with that ashlar stone, as the article mentioned. So I thought that was rather interesting. And I was originally going to write stone for my castle walls and a mixture similar to cement, because that's kind of what I thought about castles as being, and it ended up being the case for the particular Bodnum Castle and a particular Dover Castle that I was mentioning, and what I'm basing my first castle to be off of in Chapter 1. So that brings me to Chapter 1, and those who've watched my last stream would have known I only really had 2 sentences that I kind of brainstormed so far, and then I had in red what I was thinking of having the rest chapter, including in the chapter being about. But as I was going about this from Wednesday to now, I was trying to think of what I wanted to include, and I just started to write. And I was telling myself, instead of worrying about adding all those vivid adjectives and making all the writing super fancy like how I kind of want it to be, I was like, just write it the first time like a rough draft to an essay, even though this isn't really an essay and I don't want it to be that boring, trust me. But I was like, just write what you're thinking, and you can come back and fix the sentences, because no author has ever just written something down fully right the first time. So that is where you can kind of see the reds. The reds I have here are either words I want to come back and change, or they have alternative meanings to them, so I might pick one or the other. But mainly the D's here are highlighted because I want to come back and change it so that it won't read D every time, because nobody wants to have 3 sentences in a row that start with D. But it's just something that I wanted to get myself into writing, because if I actually start writing, I feel like I may be able to generate these ideas and figure out where the problems were with my ideas might happen. So before I do that, I'm going to take another sip. As it says, the summer sunrise hits the northeast castle wall, casting an ominous shadow even the greatest enemy would be afraid of. The poor and the wise were the only ones awake, although they lived very different lives. The village beyond the castle walls never or always knew the time of the day. So this was the first time I was trying to think of a sentence, and I'll kind of explain my logic. If I go with the first option, which is the village beyond the castle walls never knew the time of day. I need to have knew the time of day here. Never knew the time of day. And I think I originally had that. I must have took that out. Anyway, so the first option would be the village beyond the castle wall never knew the time of day. Or the second option would be the village beyond the castle walls always knew the time of the day. So my original explanation of this line and thought process was the village beyond the wall. So in other words, the poor and the serfs, where the not so wealthy, the average medieval citizen would live. So I was trying to think, well, what do I kind of want to say? And originally I was thinking of using the word never knew the time of day, because I was trying to think in reference to the royalty, which had more access to fancier equipment and more access to kind of knowing the time of day. But as I thought about it, a lot of serfs and peasants were the ones what took care of farming and took care of animals, and they woke up by the sun. And I originally started my paragraph off with mentioning the summer sunrise. And these people were often knew the time based off of sun and how long the sun was up during the day. And in general, that's how they kind of judged time of being. Although they might have not have had numbers and exactly written out, that's kind of how they judged time. So then I was like, well, I think the better thing of saying is always knew the time. Even though they didn't necessarily have a watch or have a clock. Not that watches were even invented then, but you get what I'm saying. Even though they might not have had access to fancier ways of telling time, they knew time by judging by the daylight and judging by the weather and time it took for certain things to happen. So that's where I started to think always knew the time, or always knew the time of day, kind of fit the message of what I was trying to say better. Because what I'm trying to say is that these village people knew the time of day because of them having to do work the fields and work taking care of animals and things like that. But I'll continue reading, and I'll read that sentence over again. The village beyond the castle walls always knew the time of day. As the sun grew to its majestic beauty, glowing into just the finest hues of reds, oranges, and yellows, Sir Jester, along with the rest of the royalty within the castle walls, never knew this light as a wakeable force. So I put in parentheses there, look for something better, because I'm not sure if wakeable force makes any sense. In my mind, I was trying to think of something to kind of say that the sun was never something that they judged time with. They didn't really think of the sun as being as important as the town people and as the peasants and serfs who worked the land would have known the sun as being. Because as I was saying before, they judged the sun and that is how they knew time. That is how they were able to judge the days they had. And somebody is royalty wouldn't necessarily see the same thing. So I put as a wakeable force because they didn't really necessarily wake up with the sun, but rather they went about their days differently. But I'll continue reading. The towering thick ashlar walls stood so high a giant couldn't even peer over. Walls have stood for hundreds of years as the great empire of, and in his Greek letters, and it's roughly translated to ocean god's presence. But I'll read that sentence again. Walls have stood for hundreds of years as the great empire of ocean god's presence. And obviously I'm going to have to go back and kind of change that sentence so that it would actually kind of mean something. Because as of right now, the sentence doesn't particularly make that much sense. But then again, I wanted to, basically my thinking was picking two Greek words and combining them together to create an empire's name. And so the empire would have roughly translated to ocean god in the Greek letters. And obviously ocean god is a little bit pre-K fantasy or a little bit third grade fantasy. So I don't really think I'm going to necessarily go with that as the empire's name. But I'm still thinking of taking two foreign names and combining them together to mean something interesting. And this empire is based around the ocean, or based around water. Therefore, I want somewhere to be a ship and navy theme of how their empire is named and the importance of that as being in their name. So as of now, and what I have is Ocean God, and I don't think that I'm going to keep that, but I might, because what I was originally thinking was having ocean, because they're near the body of water, and then having God, because they're such a strong presence, and they believe they're such a strong presence. Because I really want this empire to be very confident in themselves, and that they're very strong, and almost in every way, it seems like they really know what they're doing, and that they're really strong. But in reality, later on in the novel series, I want that to kind of go less and less and less, so you start to doubt that this empire really is as big and as mighty as it seems. And I'll keep going. As any legendary castle that has stood the test of time, there were several layers amongst its defense. There was the 3 castle wall layers. The first, a smaller stone wall serving as the first point of defense. The second wall is a large wall with several lookout towers, along with archery towers. Then lastly, the third wall just before the main castle, protecting the important parts of the keep. So this doesn't really read like I want it to read, and as I kind of mentioned before. But I was more trying to include what the castle looked like so that if you were the reader, you didn't get bombarded with information before really getting to understand the story. And I didn't want to overly explain the defenses of the castle, because later on in the chapter I'm going to be mentioning Sir Jester and having him explain their castle defense and have a defensive plan. So I didn't want to overly explain that part of the chapter before I actually got to it. But after I was kind of reading it and thinking about it, and before this stream and reading it out now, I don't think that it really sounds very good. So I think I need to go back and change the actual words to that paragraph so that it just sounds a little bit better and more interesting, because it kind of sounds not the way I really want it to be. And as you can kind of see in the Reddit there, it says, need more research to keep vivid detail, explain in more detail, but defensive part vague as for later. And that's kind of what I just mentioned, as I wanted to include more of a defensive strategy and defensive point for later on in a chapter. And then for the next paragraph, I just had this simple sentence, as this is kind of where I wanted to start the chapter afterward. It says, this wasn't the case for villages outside the looking eyes upon the hill. This wasn't the case for the villages outside the looking eyes upon the hill. And as I read that out twice, I might have to change that too. Because my general thought was kind of mentioning the town folk and the average serf slash peasant life in a more of an anonymous type of way. Because this next couple paragraphs, I really want to go in and explain the living conditions and what the jobs were of the peasants and serfs for that particular empire and for medieval life in general, you could say. But now I'm going to read out what I have without interruptions in between, just so you can kind of read and see the flow of what I have. So I'll kind of start there. The summer sunrise hits the northeast castle wall, casting an ominous shadow even the greatest enemy would be afraid of. The poor and the wise were the only ones awake, although they lived very different lives. The village beyond the castle wall never knew the time of day. As the sun grew to its majestic beauty, glowing into just the finest hues of red, oranges, and yellows, Sir Jester, along with the rest of the royalty within the castle walls, never knew this light as a wakeable force. The towering thick ashlar walls stood so high a giant couldn't even peer over. Walls have stood for hundreds of years as the great empire of Ocean God. As any legendary castle that has stood the test of time, there were several layers amongst its defense. There was three castle wall layers. The first, a smaller stone wall serving as the first point of defense. The second wall is a large wall with several lookout towers along the archery towers. Then lastly, the third wall just before the main castle, protecting the important parts of the keep. And obviously I'm not just going to keep important parts in my paragraph as well, because I need to go on and explain what those parts actually are. As I kind of said with the red, but just behind there. But you can kind of get where I was thinking along with these next couple paragraphs. So that is where I was left off from last Wednesday to now. At least I actually got some writing done, so I'm happy with that. But in today's stream, and kind of what I wanted to think about a little bit more is how I want to go on from here. So originally I've kind of already talked about that I want to talk about the housing conditions for the medieval and serf life, and I also want to mention what the roles would have been for the serfs and peasants of that particular empire. And then I'm going to go on to compare the rich and the royalties' lives of the same empire as that being. So that is where I was between now and then. So I thought on today's stream it might be a little bit different, as I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to try writing some sentences and kind of thinking out loud for where I want to go. I'm not particularly sure how this is going to go, because sometimes the dots can take a while to actually generate into a dot that makes sense. But it's worth a try just to see how well it goes or how well it doesn't go, as you have to at least try things once. Okay. So I have here somewhere, I believe, yes, right here. So I have here somewhere the average house of the medieval / serf life and what it would have been like to live during those times. And those that have watched my last stream or the stream before, I kind of went into deeper detail about what the life would have been like as a peasant or as a serf. And John was on the stream and kind of mentioned a few things that he felt were inaccurate about the articles. And I've done further research and learned that in a large part, John was correct. But he's very big into history, so I didn't really doubt it in the first place. But anyway, that's kind of where the last streams kind of covered. But I was going to bring up this picture in a little bit more of a detail, even though in particular the peasants didn't have straw in that time period, as John mentioned. You could kind of see the baseline of what their house would have looked like. because in one of the articles it mentioned that a lot of times for the serf and peasant's life, they would have had their animals actually live with them. As you can kind of see the mattress over here, along with animals and a water bin for the mattress, and a water bin for the animals, along with a fire over here and some general cooking supplies and other things. But the more thing I was interested in was here. As you can kind of see the layered stone and mud walls along with straw on top. And as John was kind of saying, and I've mentioned a little bit, that straw wasn't necessarily available, but you would have had some dry grass or other things kind of similar to straw. But the main structure of the house kind of looks similar to this. And obviously they weren't too fancy like compared to the medieval and rich lives that lived more in keeps and almost like bedrooms that we think about in today's time. But you can kind of see a little bit more of a fancier peasant house, as you can see from history notes here. And they were darker because they didn't have access to light as much, or they would have been really light if they didn't do a very good job. Anyway, I shouldn't laugh at that. So you can kind of see in general like what their houses would have looked like. Because a lot of times they were made out of muds and grasses and dry grasses that kind of built up into a physical house that they kept animals in and had very basic type of supplies so that they could keep themselves alive. So, as I was kind of thinking where I wanted to describe this scenario into this next paragraph, and as I kind of mentioned my idea about kind of writing a little bit live and thinking out loud, and those who are watching now or watching later, I'll be interested to see if you thought it went well or if you have any ideas. Because it's very open, and this book is very open as I'm making streams about it. And one, it's to hold me accountable. And two, three things. One, it's to hold me accountable. Two, I hope that you enjoy watching them as I enjoy making them. And three, it's kind of thinking out loud and brainstorming out loud. So if you have any ideas, feel free to share them. I'm not necessarily going to take all ideas because it is may not fit to my overall plan of the story. Well, you can kind of get what I'm saying. So I'm just going to kind of think out loud and write. And hopefully this doesn't bounce too much, as I try to keep the screen a little bit more steady compared to some of my other streams. I noticed that there was a slight bounce or jiggle to the camera and other things, which I'm not completely sure why, but I think I have that fixed, but we'll see. So I need to describe the housing conditions for the peasants and serfs in writing. And obviously we know, as I just said, that they were made out of mud and dry grass and didn't necessarily have straw. So I don't think I'm going to necessarily include that. But I was trying to think of where I wanted to start this particular paragraph. Do I want to start it with naming the peasant or serf, or do I want to keep the people unknown, like have a family but they're not named? I can even do the necessarily right of naming their owner or their master, you could say, instead of the particular person in general, because I can have it as in that role too. But I think I kind of want to keep the story narrowed into one perspective, or maybe a family's perspective, but still keeping it detailed in that scenario. So I don't think that I'm going to name the peasant or name the family, but I do think I'm going to almost like take a deep dive into just one house of the medieval village and not necessarily take the entire medieval village itself. And I see Ron as he says, this wasn't the case for villages outside the watchful eyes of those upon the hill, or beyond the watchful eyes. Yeah, that's the thing is, as I read the sentence out loud, I don't think that it really made that much sense, but I think you can kind of see the route I was wanting to go. And also, hi Ron, because I kind of wanted to keep, as I said a little bit earlier, I kind of wanted to keep the scenario Onimus because I kind of want to create interest into wanting to learn about the peasants, and that I do think I like the Beyond the Watchful Eyes because that's kind of what I was trying to think, because the royalty in general, as a stance of royalty, I can't speak. In general, the sense of royalty wanted to keep an eye on the poor, but didn't necessarily care about the poor very much. Like, you could take, for example, Game of Thrones, which this novel is kind of highly inspired after, because that's kind of what created my interest in wanting to write this novel, because, as I've mentioned in my couple streams before, it was originally a school project, and Game of Thrones kind of inspired me to write the novel as a whole and to keep the novel fresh. So yeah, I do think I like that one, but in general, the royalty didn't really care too much about the peasants' lives. They more wanted to make sure that the money the empire was getting are their lives were steady and not necessarily the lives of everyone else, and especially not the lives of the poor, as long as they were doing their jobs. So I think that Beyond the Watchful Eyes works because it's kind of the feel and the reality of the situation. So, as I was kind of discussing and as I was thinking before the stream and thinking now, I think I want to dive into one family's perspective in describing the poor of that house and their living conditions and other things related to that. And I might expand it to part of the village or the entire village and then go to the rich. But I do think that I want to keep the poor perspective of the individual household owner, then compare it to the rich of the royalty and kind of like what their scenario was and their living conditions. Because I think not only does it seem very logical, but it also seems like a good way to not only quickly explain the living conditions of both and really detail the environment that way, but to bring an understanding to this empire, because this is going to be an empire that is going to be used heavily in my novel. So I'll get to thinking out loud a little bit here. Let's see. Yeah, I like never write good the first time, which is something I think a lot of writers probably struggle with. But with my dyslexia and really not reading that much until recently, I don't necessarily have a good stance of writing as a whole. So it's something I'm really trying to build on, and not just reading books more, but also just writing more in general. But I was just trying to think here, like how I want to start this off and how I want to start this next sentence for this paragraph. The village beyond the looking eyes upon the hill. Beyond the watch. Yeah, I do like Beyond the Watchful Eyes. I do like that. I'll put that in red. Beyond the Watchful Eye. Beyond the Watchful Eyes. We'll keep that red. Alrighty. Because what I'm really struggling about is how I want to talk about the housing conditions, or talk about the village and talk about the individual family's life of the poor without jumping right into it, because I kind of want there to be a lead to it. I want it to kind of make sense of why we're talking about these conditions, and not just keep it at the real basic level of the novel, or real basic level of understanding. In other words, I don't want the novel to read like an essay, because that's something I've struggled with writing in general. I've gotten decently good at writing essays and writing stories, or writing essays for school and government class and psychology and science. I've gotten very good at that type of structure. But when you read a story, it's not really that structure at all, because you don't necessarily want to think about it like an essay. You more want to think about it like a a short story that isn't for a school project, that isn't have to have a structure. Yes, most good stories do have a structure. They have the rising action, the falling action, the climax. You have all these parts that in general make a good story, because as humans and as a society, we've always kind of had a way of telling stories in a way that makes stories interesting. But at the same time, I don't think that most good writers and people we think about, like, C.S. Lewis or is it Scott Fitzgerald, or people who make these fancy novels they have a structure, but they don't write it like a school essay or any essay that's kind of related to it. So Ron says, concrete on the story and worry about the grammar when you are finished, unless you see a better word right after you write it. Oh, concentrate, not concrete. Finished, yeah. Will you be developing a few of the poor villagers? That's what I was trying to think. So I'll talk about your first point, Ron. That's kind of what I've been thinking about in my head, because a large part of my head and what I'm trying to get over so that I just physically write more and don't really think about it is I don't want to too much worry about the vivid detail right now. But at the same time, I want to make sure I add a note so that I can go back. Because what I don't want to happen is as I write this story, I keep it at the level of writing I don't necessarily want it to be at, and then ignore it just because I'm like, okay, I like in general the way it is. I want it to be better than I have it now, but I don't want to necessarily concentrate on that so much that I don't end up writing in general. Because this is the most amount of writing I've done in a while for the story and of the past couple streams. And in general, I like it. So what I've kind of been telling myself is don't really concentrate too much on adding the vivid detail, but get things out. And then you can go back when you're finished with the paragraph or you're finished with your dot and kind of add some dots when you read the sentence out loud or read the sentence again that you might can change. But don't focus on it so much that it bogs down the story and bogs down the writing process. Because I did the stream last on Wednesday and I only had like these first two sentences. So I had Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then now. So I had 4 days of writing time that I could write. So anytime I had a gap, I was able to kind of think about writing, because it takes me a while to get into the writing mind and to get into the writing process so that I can actually get down and put, in this case, writing on or typing. But you get what I'm saying. To actually put the pen on paper and to start writing, it takes a little bit of time to kind of get my thought process going. It just doesn't happen naturally. So, as you were kind of saying, I am focused very much on actually writing and actually having content, and then I might go back. Because a lot of writers, what I've heard from YouTubers, not that they're great or anything, but what I've heard in general about writing advice is you finish out your thought and then you can go back. A lot of writers will finish out whole chapters and sometimes even whole books before they go back and change grammar and change more detail or take things out and add things in. But the way I am is I want to make sure I write slow enough that it stays good. Make sure I write a little bit above the way I am writing now, but don't bog it down so much that it takes like years just to write a whole chapter. Obviously, I don't think it will, but it's just something I've kind of been focusing about. And then your second question here, will you be developing a few of the poor villagers? So that's kind of what I was thinking. I was thinking when I was going to describe the poor I was going to describe a family. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to give the family names, even though names are a real easy way to build up a character in the story and to build up interest within who the villagers are. But I don't know if I want to necessarily give the villagers names yet, because I kind of want to keep the villagers as a type of people or a type of class. Because I'm kind of comparing the poor to comparing the poor, and I might, or comparing the poor to comparing the rich. So that's a process that I've been thinking about. So I think I'm struggling between if I want to give them names or not. As of now, I say no, but as I start to write, I might struggle with providing content or making sense with it in my head. But as your sentence just under reads, polished apple after growing, but before eating. So right, that's kind of what you're saying. So I kind of want to finish my thought out fully and then come back and see if there's anything to change or if there's might be a different way to write it that still kind of has the same meaning. So right now I say that I don't think I'm going to necessarily give names to the poor family I'm writing about, but I do plan on developing the poor family a little bit more without necessarily giving them names, explaining the way their house looks, explaining the way their lives were, explaining what they did at the start, the middle, the end of their days, and explaining in general what they thought of their lives. So I don't know if necessarily I can do that without giving the villagers names, because it is a very easy way to build character and a way to add characters within the story, because I don't just want to keep the rich characters or the main soldier type of characters as the only ones who are either minor or major characters in the story. I do want to have poor villagers and poor families and poor people within my story as having names and having major/minor character roles. So by giving them names, not only will I might be able to do that in the future, I'll be able to mention this family more, because I do think that giving more perspectives to the story is a good idea. So by having this poor villager having a name, it could be a good way later on in the story, whenever I mention this empire again, to talk about them and give the reader a perspective that they already know within the story. And Jimmy says, and hey Jimmy, he says used Grammarly. Yeah, I have Grammarly on my computer and I actually use it a lot. It's a really, 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 really helpful tool, especially for me, because almost every sentence I write has a couple spelling errors. Oh man, that's always fun. So yeah, I use Grammarly a lot, especially for school projects. I use it. But for this, I just did a spell check. I'm sure that those who are good at grammar now might see a couple spelling errors that I don't see. And that's something I need to look at again before I start my next stream. But like I kind of was already saying, I just want to finish out my ideas before I really look back and change grammar or add or remove anything. And then Ron says, some of them have their own editors to help them polish the final product. Yeah, a lot of the good writers, all good writers have editors to help them kind of look through works. Like a lot of things I hear are reading buddies, people who look through your story and kind of talk about things that they don't make much sense, or spelling errors they see within reading your story. And really a good way of doing that is having online streams, which is something I actually am doing. So if there is a bad idea, or if there's an idea I think, or the reader thinks, in this case the viewer think needs to be expanded on, I feel like y'all guys would be able to tell me, or not necessarily spelling errors, because that wouldn't necessarily make too much sense, but even spelling errors y'all guys might be able to see that I don't see through looking at my story. But you can kind of get what I'm saying there, because everybody needs editors in their work. Even the best writers who tend to not have that many spelling errors still need editors, because we're not perfect and they're probably going to have a spelling error somewhere in there, or some part of the story that just doesn't make much sense. Because as writers, we have it in our heads and what we think the story is and what we think each part is. But as readers, we're not necessarily in the author's head, so we don't necessarily get everything that makes sense. The author may be able to explain 3 links between that next plot, but in reality there was actually 5, and 2 were in his own mind that he never said, but the reader still needed to know for it really to make sense. That's kind of the way I think about it. Jimmy says, this essay kind of looks like the series The Witcher. I haven't really seen the Witcher, Jimmy, but it is one of the ones I want to watch, as I just recently got Netflix. Well, the family got Netflix, and I believe that's a Netflix series if I remember right. But yeah, that is a series I want to watch, because I've watched Game of Thrones and I watched a lot of the Vikings series. Not that the Vikings is super related to Game of Thrones, but you can kind of get some perspectives from it. And I know The Witcher has been real popular within the fantasy type of community, and I've seen a lot of YouTube reviews or YouTubers review it. I haven't really watched any of their videos yet because I haven't seen it any episodes yet, so I didn't really want to watch the reviews and have it spoiled. But that is something that is actually on my watch list, and I can't really tell you if it's similar or not because I haven't seen it yet. But okay, so I think as of now, I'm just going to think about what's on my mind and kind of write it out. I want to mention the housing, the way the houses were to look. I think that's a good place to start when describing the poor and this part of the story. So as of now, I'm just going to kind of jot down some ideas in a sentence or 2 sentence format, whatever just kind of comes out, and I'll kind of go back and like think about it a little bit. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to write about the houses, and then I'll think about a link transition, because that first sentence, although I really like it and I think I'm going to keep it, I don't know how I'm necessarily going to link it into then describing the poor. I think it mentions the poor pretty well in a good way, but I'll kind of go back to kind of figure out how I want to link it into the rest of the sentence that I'm going to make. This is where else. And I just noticed it is a little blurry on your end of the screen. I don't know if that's the same for y'all, because I have a second computer here that I'm watching just to make sure that there's no technical issues or anything like that. But is it blurry on your side as well? Because I might have to look into that when I'm actually doing this type of writing, just so that it's a little bit more clear. Might be an OBS setting or something like that I can change, but just let me know if it's kind of blurry-ish on your end as well. The houses were all slightly. I'm going to spell check it real quick. So right now I have the sentence, the houses were all slightly different as they were built with the hands of their owner. And where I'm kind of going from here is these houses were built with mud and like dry grasses, as I've probably said 1,000 times now. But the houses weren't necessarily built to withstand a long period of time like a castle were. So I think where I'm going to go from here is kind of briefly mention that. So those that don't really catch it after I mention like what the material the houses were made of, I want to make sure that they understand that although they built these houses, they didn't necessarily build them to last as long as a castle were. And that might be something I have to look up just so I know in general how long these type of houses were to last. Because I kind of assume that they tried their best to make the house last as long as it could. But I don't necessarily know if this was a multi-generational type of housing or if this was something that had to get built every, 12 years or less than that type of thing. also hate the red, so I always have to make sure I go back and kind of change the reds here. Although each owner was different, the material was still the same. As I kind of have, although each owner was different, the material was still the same: poor mud and dry grasses. And then I'll spell check this real quick. This was okay. I'll read the sentence here. Although each owner was different, the material was still the same: poor mud and dry grasses, therefore causing an uncomfortable unity. So I was somewhat afraid of this type of strategy because it's hard to kind of think out loud and write. So again, you'll have to let me know, those who are watching or watching afterwards, if you kind of like this idea. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of think out loud and to write afterwards about kind of where I was thinking of going with this project or with this story, and maybe you being able to add your perspective live or kind of judge the way it's going in the comment section. But at the same time, I don't want there to be too much downtime and to make it kind of boring to watch afterwards or watch now. So you'll have to let me know if you kind of like this idea or not, but I'll go on from here. So right now, I kind of want to give this house a name. So I think I think I'm going to go with naming the villagers after all, because I think, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, it's a good way to kind of build up character in the story, and it is something I want to mention afterwards, because I do want to have like poor type of characters have a name and have a purpose within my story as well, because I don't want there to just be main characters of the rich and of the noble class and of the soldiers, and not have other groups and types of people that lived in the medieval times. So I think that I am going to give it a name. So I'm trying to think of a medieval name right now that I could give it. I think I'm just going to give something generic and put it in red. And I might come back later to kind of change names and to change the overall house of the what it was called, because in general the medieval times had a class type of structure of naming. So a lot of times you would be called like Sir William the Carpenter or Sir John the metalsmith, or you get what I'm kind of saying. You had these titles, I guess is a better way of saying it. But the serfs and peasants didn't really get the classification of being called a title. They didn't have the reason to become a title, so they wouldn't necessarily have a title now. But for later on in the story, I need to make sure that I remember that. But I'm just going to kind of give a name here and put it in red. For some reason I have John Smith on my mind, so I'm just going to call him John Smith. Okay. The John Smith household. And then I want to describe the house. And that's kind of what I'm thinking from here. So the John Smith household. How do I want to go from here? The John Smith household. I might have to change the words here a little bit to kind of keep my mind going. The John Smith household. I'm just going to put as I put, the John Smith household also had dry mud and grasses. The house in particular was built with layers upon layers of the wettest mud taking many days to dry. Once dry, parts of the house could see cracks as the foundation was already okay. Once dry, parts of the house could see cracks as the mud decided the result of once dry, parts of the house could see cracks as the mud decided the results of the time and effort. And Ron says the John Smith house was slightly larger than most due to the extra addition to the house where John pilled his trade as a blacksmith. And maybe I will have John as a blacksmith or John Smith as a blacksmith in the story. But as of now, I was more thinking a farming route than a blacksmith route. But then again, John Smith could be a blacksmith, but the other parts of his family were farmers or things related to that. So that might be a route I end up going. But I more mentioned the blacksmith or metalsmith because of that's typically the way names were given. You would have like John Smith, the blacksmith, that type of thing. So that's kind of what I mentioned that for. But it is a good idea that I might include because you had metalsmiths in the peasant and serf community, and you also had metalsmiths in the royalty community. When we tend to think of metalsmiths, we tend to think of royalty and people who made swords, but there was also simply metalsmiths to make metal and to make objects that you could farm with for the metal, and in general be a general metalsmith and not somebody that was used for making weapons. So again, that's actually a pretty good idea that I wasn't really thinking too much about. The house so you can kind of see the way my mind thinks, because earlier in the story, if you catch the stream at the beginning, you notice that I had the and highlighted red, and I'm going to highlight these in red also because again, I don't want my sentence to read D, or the story to read D, because it's something that's kind of boring, and I do think that the average reader would get quite bored, and I would get quite bored when reading this story again. But as Ron was kind of saying, and what I was saying, is I don't want to spend too much time now on devoting to changing my sentences right away, because I kind of want to build out this chapter and build out this story, then go back and kind of fix those type of errors. So again, I'm going to keep going, but I just thought I would point that out. As you can see, again, I'm starting with D because it's just the way my mind thinks. Stride parts of the house could see cracks as the mud decided the results of the time and effort. The John Smith household had many trades. I put the John Smith household had many trades and was one of the oldest peasant houses. Does that make sense? One of the oldest peasant houses? I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense. I might have to change that too, but let's see. I don't like red at all. Okay, peasant houses. The John Smith household had many trades, and one was... I think I'll put... The John Smith household focused on farming with the oldest house and family of the peasant folk. So I put the John Smith household focused on farming with the oldest house and family of peasant folk. So I was kind of thinking in my head, and what I was going to put in that sentence, what you can see there, was I wanted to include farming within my story and kind of talk about what that would have been like as a peasant and what that would have been like in the medieval times when you had to farm for your living, and that was what your job was. And also, if you don't know marital structure in the medieval times, if you were married someone who was higher up in class than you, you would be able to be granted into their class. So, for example, if a peasant were to marry someone who lived within the castle walls, they would be able to then be upper class and no longer be a peasant, and that was something that's rather important. By saying that they were the oldest house and family of the peasant folk means that the John Smith family only married within themselves or married within other peasants, therefore making their situation being the oldest peasant family. So that would be rather interesting to have peasants marry within themselves, although in general, and this is kind of relating into today's time, we tend to marry folks that are similar to us or folks that kind of have same values as us, so there does make some sense even then for the medieval times. But that would be an interesting side note to anybody what kind of knows history or didn't know it but knows it now about that, the class system. So by the fact of them marrying within themselves or within marrying other peasants and being a long-standing family within the community is something that would be rather interesting and something I can expand on later on. The John Smith household focused on farming with the oldest house and family of the peasant folk. See, I haven't described the house in that much detail yet. But as I've been writing and thinking out loud, I don't really see the opportunity to describe it now with what I have written, because what I was kind of thinking of going on next is describing their individual lives. So I think I would have to go up further and to change their houses, the way it was written to describe their house in greater detail. So I don't know necessarily what I'm going to do there, but I'm just going to kind of continue my thought process out and not worry too much about it. And by next Monday of next week, you'll be able to see what kind of direction I was going with. So that would be a good idea. And those who are still here in the comment section, you could kind of think about your ideas. I'm probably going to be ending the stream in about like 7 minutes or so. So if you have any other ideas or have any questions for me, feel free to comment in the comment section if you have any questions. But I'll kind of just be thinking here about how I want to go next. Well, I could go back in this direction with this. See, right here, was because it's something I'm not a fan of. But I can go back and kind of change that language and something I kind of want to do, but I'll just kind of continue my thought. I think I'm going to include a little bit of fantasy perspective in this novel series because although I want to keep it somewhat historically based, I am going to have a slightly different type of characteristics so that the story becomes a little bit more interesting and just a little more different, so that it's not just like a historical novel, because it's obviously I haven't studied the medieval times in a major or a professor type of way, but more of a general person that is interested in the medieval times. So there may not be three different types of mud, but I'm going to say that there are three different types of mud in the story, just to make it slightly my own and just slightly different to what the actual would have been like. But in general, I tend to think that the actual stuff, what happens in real life, is more interesting and more fascinating than stuff to make that you can purely make up in your head. And I think a perfect example of that is with Tiger King, as you have somebody like Joe Exotic and all the other bunches that did all this crazy stuff. And I don't think even a Stephen King or somebody who's a really creative writer could have come up with the scenario of Joe Exotic and what actually happened in real life. And Ron says, maybe John has a handsome daughter who has caught the eye of one of the royals and she is taken. Yeah, that was it was kind of funny that you said that because that was a interesting route I was thinking of taking. Is obviously you're going to have some sort of romance in your book, or at least I say obviously. I think a lot of good stories are kind of built on relationships, and although I'm not making a love story, I am going to have love components within my novel. So I was thinking that a good way to kind of expand on it, because I was going to keep the John Smith family within the peasant community and being someone was kind of a staple within the community. But that was funny because I was thinking later on in the story of having her either fall in love with somebody of royalty, but more having someone of royalty fall in love with her, or maybe a high-ranking soldier was kind of the route I was thinking of, and not necessarily someone that is strictly royalty, but having some sort of love connection between the peasant community and the royalty community. So yeah, it was kind of funny that you mentioned that as well, because that was a route I was planning to go with that, Ron. So the house was built with 3 different types of mud. As the first acted as a binder, the second as a crack resistor. That's bad. And the third and the final as a smooth I'm going to spell check this real quick and read out that sentence. The house was built with 3 different types of mud, as the first acted as a binder, the second as a crack resistor, and the final as a smooth holder. I don't even think crack resistor is a word, but I'll go back and change that later. Alrighty. So yeah, I'm going to be ending the stream in about 2 or so minutes. So if you have anything else to say in the comment section, feel free to say. If you have any questions for me, go ahead and say it. We'll have some time to address them. And I really thank Ron and Jimmy for catching the stream live. It definitely does help having an audience and be able to kind of brainstorm off of and talk to and within the virtual world, you could say. But yeah, that was very funny that Ron was mentioning with his with the daughter component, because I was thinking of having a similar component, or if not the same component, happening within my story later on in the chapters. And it was interesting with Jimmy kind of saying that it seemed like The Witcher, even though I haven't seen the Witcher series. I have heard good things about it and want to see it. And again, thank you, Jimmy, and for catching the stream again. So that's very good. So I'm going to kind of think about maybe 2 or 3 more sentences, and then I'll kind of end the stream there. So if you have any questions, as I've already said, feel free to comment them. I'll try to address them before I leave. And if you're watching now or if you're watching later, feel free to give me a like. And if you really like the content, you can go ahead and subscribe. That would help a lot. But I'll kind of think about where I want to go from here. The outside layer was covered in dry grass as every other household, or every other house. I'll put household as every other household. The difference with John Smith the difference with the John Smith house was the grass layering itself. The grass was layered in rows going downward and across, binding on its binding on itself like a lashing. I'll put diagonal lashing. Diagonal. Ooh, I don't know. I spelled that one right. Oops. It's funny, if Jimmy's still here, I don't know if Jimmy's still here or not, but he'll know what a diagonal lashing is. It's something that's in Boy Scouts, or at least he should know what a diagonal lashing is if he knows his lashings anymore. But anyway, that's kind of funny and kind of a side reference that the Boy Scout should know who discovered this video or who watched it afterwards, or anyone that's kind of related in that. But I don't know if diagonal lashing would have necessarily been a verbiage or a word used in the medieval times. But in general, I was kind of thinking of having grass where it goes upward and downward, and then you have grass that's going the other direction. And in the lashing, you'll have your components that kind of weave in and out like a snake. And so our diagonal lashing was a type of lashing that kind of did that. So you would be able to build like an X or a tripod with your diagonal lashing. So that's kind of the concept I had for that. So basically the John Smith household was a little bit different because they had their grass lashed with each other and not simply just laid over on top of each other like a typical other household of the medieval times would have been, because of their experience in many generations within their peasant community. So again, those who are still here, I really appreciate you being here. You add a lot to the stream, Jimmy and Ron. It makes it a lot more fun for me, and hopefully you enjoy the stream as well. I felt like I got a little bit better at the live writing than when I started, and it's something I'll be interested if you're still watching now or if you watch later. Like I said, be interested to hear what you kind of thought about it. I might stop it if it was boring or if there were too many pauses within my thinking and within my writing. But I do think it's a good idea to kind of fill my thought process and how I go about writing the story and writing the book, and having your thoughts about it as well as I go about writing it. Because I do think that Ron's ideas with the blacksmith and with the daughter were interesting, because it was something I was either didn't really think about or something I had thought about. And I don't think that you would necessarily get that if I were to do my other type of streams. So again, I would appreciate if you give me a comment or on the video, or find my Discord or Twitter and see if you kind of like that idea, because I think I'll continue it on the next stream, as I think I got a little bit better at it, so that I can actually kind of feel my thought process go on the stream. So we'll see what happens from that between now and this next stream. But I also appreciate it if you check out my later content. I plan to have a couple of other videos out this week that are more regular videos. And I also might plan to do a live stream as well. And I might do another weekend live stream, but we'll just see how things go. I don't want to say what I'm going to end up doing or overestimate, or whatever verbiage you want to use. Again, I appreciate those who are watching now or watching later, and I hope you catch me on my next one.